everyone, and welcome to another watercolor tutorial. Today we are going to be painting this beautiful pine cone. It could be in the spirit of the holidays coming up, or it could just be an autumn painting, whichever you prefer. So the first thing I started out with doing was sketching out my pine cone, and the easiest thing to do is to probably choose a pine cone that is more flat, where the scales sort of overlap one another in a very flat shape, because the pine cones where the scales stick out quite a bit, those are a little bit more complicated to paint. I haven't even tried painting one of those, perhaps in the future, but because this was my first time painting a pine cone, I wanted to go with something more simple. So the best piece of advice, I guess, that I could give that I got from painting this was that you, in your first layer of the pine cone, using brown watercolor paint, you want to just outline the bottom of every single scale. So you'll see that each scale is sort of in this trapezoid diamond triangle shape, and you want to just darken the bottom of every single point. Every single scale has a little point sticking out, so underneath it you just outline that with light brown watercolor. And once that first layer has dried, you can start going over it with darker shades of brown and even adding some black highlights as you go on. There isn't really necessarily a technique to this. You just sort of add brown highlights to portions where you put down your first layer of brown. You just don't cover the entire first layer of brown, because you want the different shades of brown to come up through the layers and create this sort of three-dimensional shape. So just keep that in mind. You don't want the entire thing to be covered in one layer or one shade of brown. You want some white poking through, you want some super dark highlights, even some black highlights later on, just to add more variety and more detail to the pine cone itself. You can also go ahead and add some pine branches sticking out from your pine cone. This just adds a layer of color, like a pop of color, a little bit of green contrast since the pine cone is pretty brown. You definitely don't have to add the pine branches, but I just thought it looked really nice, and it definitely made the pine cone look a lot more Christmassy rather than autumn themed, but that's okay. So the thing I did with the pines is sort of the same process that I followed for the pine cone. I started out with just a light color of green, flicking out the pine needles from my sort of center stem in each direction. And as those dried, I just gradually applied darker and darker flicks to each pine branch to create sort of contrasting pines and adding more and more layers to those pines so that you could see both light and dark pine needles coming out from each one. I even went ahead and added some tiny brown dots to some of the pine branches as well, and these are just supposed to be, little tiny pine cones that have not yet sprouted, and it just adds a little bit more contrast to your painting and detail. I also splattered some brown watercolor onto the painting just to make it look a little bit more abstract. And I also took some white acrylic paint and just went over the darkest parts of the darkest scales of the pine cone, just sort of outlining them in a very, very thin layer of white acrylic paint. So here I'm using my quadruple zero Winsor Newton brush. And then I went ahead and flickered on some more white watercolor just to make it even more abstract. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in next week's episode.